I would like to tell you the story of Mrs. Robinson and 13 Red Roses by Earl Robinson. I have lived 77 years from February the 4th, 1901. In this manuscript, I go back over 55 years and relive my life with Wilma Gladys Ayers, Mrs. Robinson. How the brain can see the past and move the hand to write this manuscript is God's secret, built in man and woman. I will take you in the upper room with me, where Mrs. Robinson lay dead for over 8 hours. I will show you how God gave me knowledge to put life back in that dead body. I will prove beyond any doubt the condition we call death today is not true death. You will know the brain is not dead, but asleep. When God created man, he created a machine that could build itself and rebuild itself and repair itself. It is our job to deliver into this machine life-giving material for it to work with, not only in food by mouth, but the things we see with our eyes, our godly thoughts to run this machine, man. Look out into space. Where did space come from? How big is space? Look at the planet Earth. Where did all this material come from? Yes, it is so. How little is man? How big is God? Mrs. Robinson and 13 Red Roses. I dedicate this book to the millions of people suffering and dying in the spirit and body. You will enjoy reading Mrs. Robinson and 13 Red Roses. It is a true story of a girl of the mountains, a girl who was dead 8 long hours. God gave her life. She lived again. I ask your support to overcome death as we know it today. God wants us to live for hundreds of years and never grow old. When he calls us, we will just go to sleep, and our soul will go to a new body. God's will be done. Let us live with a spirit of joy, a spirit of happiness. Let us eat good food, a spirit to help our doctors, and trust God to heal our bodies. Mrs. Robinson, loved by her God, tempered in a fire of love, fear, starvation, and death, arose from the dead and lived 46 years. Mrs. Robinson was dead and given new life. I believe God wants you to know he lives with us today, and the time has come to understand death, and the fear of death will be no more. In reading this book, you will understand. My name is Joseph Earl Robinson, the husband of Mrs. Robinson. I believe God has called on me to tell his people on this earth, do not fear death, and do not fear to live in this body. Many people will live to be 150 years that are living today. Did Mrs. Robinson really die? Come to the end of life? Yes, as we know it today. God is going to change that. Now let me tell you the life story of Mrs. Robinson and 13 Red Roses. The death of Mrs. Robinson's mother. The story of Mrs. Robinson begins at the death of her mother, Mrs. Verta May Ayers, in early 1917. Mrs. Robinson's father was dead, leaving Verta May with 4 children, 3 boys and 1 girl. The oldest of the boys, Ray, was working in the daytime driving horses for Virgil Brown, the undertaker, and working in the glass factory at night. The money he earned he gave his mother. This was the only income the family had. When Verta May became sick, very sick, Gladys, the only girl, 11 years old, helped take care of her two younger brothers, Marl and Paul. Paul was a baby. Gladys told me one day the doctors came to see Mother. She was very sick. He worked with another doctor and operated on Mother on the dining table. No time to take her to the hospital. Verta May died during the operation. Ray was only 16 years old. He hurried home to his little brothers and sister. A man came from a nearby town to take little Paul away to be adopted. After the funeral, Ray, Marl, Gladys, was taken to live with Verta May's mother, the children's grandma, Everly. It was a sad day for Grandma. She only had one girl. Now she was dead. I met my wife, Wilma Gladys Ayers. My life with Mrs. Robinson began in Morgantown, West Virginia. Morgantown was a pretty little town along a river, the Monongahela, flowing between hills into the Ohio River at Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Morgantown was a great glass manufacturing town. 10 glass factories employing thousands of people, the West Virginia University, and a lot of good schools and many churches. I was born here and spent most of my life in and around Morgantown. It was 1920. My mother and me was visiting my only sister, Jessie Yonts. Jessie was a godly woman and spent her life in work for Jesus Christ. I once said, "Jessie, where will heaven be?" She looked at me and said, "Earl, heaven will be here on this earth, on this planet." One evening, Jessie was telling my mother and me about a young man, Leslie Lemons, that just came back from war. He was buried today. I was at the funeral and met a young girl there. She has no mother or father. Both are dead. She is coming here tonight and stay a few days. That evening a girl came to the door. Jessie invited her in and said to me, "Meet Gladys Ayers." I looked at her. She was beautiful. Long, dark brown hair, and her eyes sparkled. They were so dark. She smiled and said, "Pleased to meet you." Miss Ayers was a picture of health. Jessie put supper on the table, and we sat down. Jessie asked God to bless the food. We enjoyed the good supper. Jessie and Miss Ayers talked about the young man and what a beautiful funeral. So many friends and so many flowers. My mother seemed to like this girl. I asked Miss Ayers to come out on the porch. We sat on the porch swing. We loved each other when we first met in the house. Miss Ayers asked me to call her Gladys. We spent the evening telling each other our past. Her mother and father both dead. Her grandmother raised her. My father was dead. I was working in a plumbing shop for $2 a day. That night I laid awake in bed and thought how pretty Gladys was. The next morning before I went to work, we made a date for that evening. Day after day in the evening, after work, we would take a walk. 2 weeks passed. We enjoyed the evenings together. Gladys came to the shop and saw me at work. My work was steady 6 days a week. One evening I asked Gladys, "Will you marry me and be my wife?" She looked at me a moment, put her arms around me and kissed me and said, "I would like very much to be Mrs. Robinson." We went in the house and told my mother and sister we wanted to get married. They kissed Gladys and gave their blessing. The next day I left my work and went to the courthouse and got our license. That evening, Gladys was so happy. And on the 7th day of September, 1920, we were married in the same house where we met. Our wedding was a home wedding in the living room. My mother, my sister, and neighbors witnessed our marriage. We had no special clothes, no flower girls, or wedding march. A parrot in a cage kept saying, "Sweet Papa, sweet Papa." The pastor of a little church married us. His name was Solomon Buckelew. He was a godly man. After the ceremony, Gladys and me walked home to the church with Pastor Buckelew. He told me to take good care of Gladys. Gladys is a member of my family. She has stayed with my wife and daughter. We all love her. Gladys is a good girl, and God tonight has made you one until parted by death. What a wonderful evening. Now we'll call Miss Ayres, Mrs. Robinson, Gladys. Gladys and me loved each other. We had no money to start life with. Gladys enjoyed telling me how she was born on a farm belonging to her grandma and Grandpa Everly. How good they were to her. Grandpa would rock me in a big old rocking chair, telling me stories until I'd fall asleep. Then Grandma would lay me in a big feather bed. I remember when Grandpa died, how we missed him, how sweet he was. Grandma raised me the most of my life. Grandma's farm is about 9 miles from here in Morgantown. They call it Bald Hill Country because of a high hill out there. In a few days we will go out, and I want you to meet Grandma and see where I live. You will love it. A few days passed, and a neighbor of Grandma's came to town. He was driving a beautiful black horse. The buggy was shiny black with red wheels. Gladys and me was going to the farm to see Grandma and Marl, Gladys's brother. Gladys said, "Meet Charlie Brewer. He is my grandma's neighbor. Charlie, meet my husband, Earl Robinson." We talked a while. Charlie said, "Gladys is part of Bald Hill. We miss her out there." All three of us were soon in the buggy and on our way to Bald Hill to the farm. The horse did not like to walk. He was a trotter. The road to Bald Hill was all dirt and bumpy. The seat had large steel springs under it and made the riding very nice. We went up steep hills and narrow roads. The farms along the roads were well cared for, good fences, and lots of cattle. Often we would pass a farmhouse, and Gladys would say who lived there. She knew every person for miles around Bald Hill. After a few hours' travel, Charlie said, "This is it." He stopped the buggy in front of Grandma's house. There on the front porch was Grandma, waving her hand. She had on a blue dress and white apron and a big smile. Charlie turned the buggy around and went home. He lived on the hill above Grandma, a large farmhouse. He had hundreds of acres of land joining Grandma's farm. Gladys said, "Grandma, I want you to meet my husband, Earl Robinson." We shook hands. Grandma was a medium-sized woman, and one look at her and I knew where Gladys inherited her dark hair and dark eyes and a loving smile. "Well, come on in the house and make yourself at home. You know this is Gladys's home." Her warm welcome made me feel at home. The rooms were large. Pretty paper covered the walls and ceilings. All around the walls was wainscoting with chair rail. It was beautiful. Gladys told me a neighbor drained and varnished it. Large fireplaces in the living room and dining room. were used in cold weather. Grandma had free gas for years. She molded clay in large balls and whitewashed them, filled the fireplace over the gas burners. When the gas was lit, the balls became white hot. They were pretty to look at and made the house warm. It was October now, warm in the daytime and cool at nights. Grandma said, "Gladys, you show Earl around while I get supper." It was good to walk around after hours in the buggy. We went outside. Gladys pointed to the house. When Grandpa and Grandpa were married, they lived in a small house in the apple orchard. That house is gone now. Grandpa built this house and they moved here. As I looked at the house, I thought how hard he worked to get the lumber and material. Then, with little help, he built the house, and now he was dead. The house was two-story frame with a front porch and back porch. "Do you feel like walking?" Gladys said. "I will show you the apple orchard." We walked down a narrow road. She told me how the cow would run off down this road, and she would come and drive her home at milking time. We came to the orchard. Hundreds of bushels of apples on the trees. They were ripe and ready to pick. Grandma makes lots of apple butter. She dries apples for pies, too. Mara will take some to the cider mill to make vinegar. A lot of the apples will keep all winter. Gladys told me the names of all these apples. I did not know there were so many kinds of apples. She learned the names from her grandma. Now this is where I told you that Grandma and Grandpa started housekeeping. Those stones is all that is left of the old house. Leaving the orchard, we walked back up the road. Gladys pointed to a low place in the field below the road. When I was a small girl, there was a big distillery there. A lot of people worked there, making apple brandy. A man by the name of South run the distillery, and that big house you see by the schoolhouse was his home. When he built that house, the men working on it stayed at Grandma's. A man from Morgantown was the foreman. His name was Charlie Thorne. He was a nice man. When the house was finished, he went back to Morgantown and started a lumber yard and general woodworking company to make things needed in building. Now let me show you the stable. This is where the cows are kept, and over here is the pig pen. Those two hogs are on corn now. That makes good lean meat. It will soon be Thanksgiving time and time to butcher. A cold spell comes about Thanksgiving. Then the meat will keep good. "Well, what is that?" I asked. "Oh, you know what that is. That's the outhouse. A two-holer with Sears and Roebuck catalog. Make yourself at home." Next, Gladys showed me the milk house. It was built in the hillside, out of stone. Gladys opened the door. It was cool inside. A little stream of water seeping out of the hill helped to make it cool. On big flat rocks on the floor was brown crocks filled with milk, butter, cream, cottage cheese, and sausage. On the sides and on the hanging shelves was fruits, cherries, red and black, peaches, blackberries, plums, pears. Glass jars filled and ready for winter. It was a real cellar built. Gladys showed me the meat house where meat was salted down. Gladys explained the hams and shoulders and side meat would not spoil when properly salted. Explained how Grandma would heat it until lard formed on the top, then put it in the milk house. It would not spoil there in the cool. Gladys said, "Now let me show you the garden." It was a large garden, all fenced in to keep the chickens out. The fence was covered with vines, hops, currants, blackberries, grapes. She knew them all. See that pear tree between the garden and the house? Grandma cooks those small pears in spices. I want you to eat some. They are so good. Earl, you being a town boy and never worked on a farm, can see living on a farm is hard work, very hard. Milking cows, churning butter, feeding the chickens, gathering the eggs, feeding the pigs, plowing the garden, planting, digging potatoes and storing onions, making apple butter, picking fruit, making vinegar, repairing fences. Now that is but a few of the chores, 6 days a week, hard work and long hours. In return, plenty of good food and fresh air, fresh country air. Isn't it wonderful? Grandma came to the kitchen door and called us to supper. I will never forget the food on the table and how good it smelled. Big loaves of home-baked bread, cow's butter, cream, small potatoes, fresh out of the garden, cooked with plenty of lean beef, and those spices Gladys told me about. They were so good. Apple pies and cakes. Grandma and Marl, Gladys and me sat down. Now, Earl, you just help yourself. You're at home. Gladys's home is your home. Mealtime on the farm was a place to enjoy good food and reviewing the day's work. This time, Grandma wanted to know what Gladys and me were going to do, and she would help all she could. Grandma wanted Gladys to be happy. She loved Marl, Gladys, and Ray, and Gladys. When supper was over, Grandma spread white cloth on the table. Now, if you get hungry, you know where it is. Gladys helped Grandma wash the dishes and said, "Come." We went out in the out in the front yard, and sat down in a large swing with 2 seats. It was so easy. Gladys told me when I was a little girl I would swing and listen to the chirps of the crickets. Years later, Gladys told me I don't like crickets. I guess she was thinking back when she was a little girl, sitting alone in the evening, listening to the crickets. On Sunday, the farm families would go to church. The church was a small wood building, 4 windows on the sides and a door in front. It was painted white. Inside, there was plenty of benches to sit on. Gladys played the organ the last year she was there. The church was a meeting house. The men would get together and talk about the crops and the cattle. The women would talk about the sick and the crops and everything in farm life, and how they could help the sick and needy. The preacher read from the Bible and prayed to God to keep them well and help one another. Gladys showed me the schoolhouse where she went to school, a 1-story brick, 1 room, 1 teacher, with all the grades. Gladys walked a quarter mile to school and back home carrying lunch bucket, books, and slate. It was time for me to leave the farm and go back to Morgantown to work. The few days on the farm was something I will never forget. Gladys would stay with Grandma a few days. We filled 2 large sugar sacks with chestnuts. The ground was covered with nuts, big and brown. I tied the 2 sacks together and put them over my shoulder, about 20 pounds, I guess, kissed Gladys goodbye, and started the long walk back to Morgantown. 9 miles, about 7 miles going to Morgantown. I looked back. Gladys was waving. A neighbor of Grandma's came to the week and brung Gladys. Gladys brung a lot of things from Grandma's to help us start housekeeping. My mother decided to stay with my sister Jessie, so she did not need her furniture and house. Mother gave Gladys her furniture, and we rented the house. A few weeks later, we bought a lot and started to build a house of our own. I worked at the plumbing shop every day and worked on the house in the evening and nights. The house was 2.5 stories, built on a hillside. There were 2 rooms in the basement, a hall, a dining room, kitchen, and living room on the first floor, baths and 3 bedrooms upstairs. 11 months passed, and Gladys gave birth to our first baby, a big baby girl. This was on July the 8th, 1921. Gladys named the baby Marjorie Dorothea. Margie was a pretty baby with lots of hair. She looked like Gladys. The baby was perfect. God had blessed us with our first child. The baby was born at home in our new house. In those days, a doctor always came to the house and the home, and the new baby was a family affair. The husband was at his wife's bedside. A few months passed. One evening, Gladys asked me to look at Marjorie. She seemed to be sleeping and breathing short and fast, with a gurgling sound. It did not sound good. I walked to town about a half mile and told the doctor. He put his pill case in the buggy and drove to the house, our home. The doctor gave Gladys some syrup to pour down the baby's throat. He said there was nothing to worry about. Now Marjorie laid on my lap 2 days and not moving. We had an insurance with an old company, and one of their services was a visiting nurse. She stopped at our house and looked at the baby and told Gladys, "That baby is going to die if you don't get a baby doctor." She told us about a new baby doctor in town. I went after him in a hurry. I told the doctor how bad she was. We walked fast and soon was home. The new doctor was a young man. He laid the baby on the table and examined her and said, "Mrs. Robinson, your baby has diphtheria and a bad lung congestion." He sent me to town to the drugstore for vaccine and medicine. Marjorie was to live, thanks to this young doctor. The next day a man came from the county health department and tacked a quarantine on our house. No one could come in, and we could not go out. We did not have a telephone. We could not call for help. The days and nights were long. Our food supply was about gone. One morning, Gladys heard a scratching at the door. She opened the door, and there was the biggest cat I ever saw, and over the cat's back was the biggest rabbit. She laid the rabbit down and mewed, looked up at us, and walked away. We never saw the cat before or afterwards. The rabbit was warm. She had just caught it and brought it to us. What good meat it was.